Anna Maria Calhoun was born on February 13, 1817, at Bath Plantation in the Abbeville district of South Carolina. She entered a world where slavery was not just an economic system, but a way of life so deeply woven into the fabric of Southern society that questioning it seemed as absurd as questioning the sunrise. Her father was John C. Calhoun, one of the most powerful men in American politics. He would serve as vice president twice, as Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and as a senator from South Carolina. But John C. Calhoun would become most infamous for his passionate defense of slavery as what he called a positive good, not a necessary evil. He believed slavery benefited both the enslaved and the enslaver, a position that would influence national politics for decades and help drive the country toward civil war. Anna was one of 10 children, though only 7 survived to adulthood. She grew up at Fort Hill, a sprawling plantation of over 1,000 acres, where between 70 and 80 enslaved African Americans labored in the fields, in the mansion, and in various skilled trades. The house itself had been expanded from a modest 4-room structure into a 14-room mansion, built and maintained by enslaved carpenters. From her earliest days, Anna was surrounded by people in bondage. They cooked her meals, cleaned her rooms, cared for her when she was sick, and attended to her every need. This was the only world she knew, and she never questioned it. Her father doted on Anna. Among all his children, she held a special place in his heart, and the feeling was mutual. She once told a housemaid before her marriage that anyone who knew her idolatry for her father could sympathize with her feelings. This was no ordinary father-daughter relationship. It was an intense devotion that would shape every major decision in Anna's life. When she was 18, she moved to Washington, D.C. to work as her father's copyist, handling his correspondence and immersing herself in the political world he inhabited. She declared she would never marry, content to dedicate herself to supporting her father's career. But life had other plans. In the spring of 1838, while living in Washington with her father, 21-year-old Anna met Thomas Green Clemson. He was 31, a Philadelphia-born scientist and diplomat who had been educated in Europe at the Paris School of Mines and the Sorbonne. Despite her protestations about never marrying, Anna was smitten. After a 6-month courtship, they were married on November 13, 1838, in the parlor at Fort Hill. John C. Calhoun himself gave his favorite daughter away, though one wonders what the enslaved people who served that wedding thought as they watched another generation commit itself to the system that held them captive. The young couple initially lived in Philadelphia, where tragedy struck almost immediately. Their first child, a daughter, was born on August 13, 1839, but died within 3 weeks, victim of a fever epidemic that also killed several enslaved people at Fort Hill. In 1840, the Clemsons moved back to Fort Hill, and it was there that Anna's direct involvement with slavery truly began. On July 17, 1841, she gave birth to a son they called Calhoun to distinguish him from all the other Johns in the family. Then, on December 29, 1842, came a daughter named Floride Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers. 2 enslaved women cared for these children. Daphne, sometimes spelled Daphne in family documents, served as their wet nurse, nursing Anna's babies at her own breast while likely being separated from her own children. Her teenage daughter Susan was given to Anna and Thomas as a gift from John and Floride Calhoun. Susan became a full-time nursemaid, and the arrangement reveals the casual cruelty that defined slavery even in its most intimate forms. Susan slept in a room adjacent to Anna and Thomas's bedroom, with a string tied around her wrist. The other end of that string extended to Anna's bedside. Whenever Anna needed anything during the night, she simply pulled the string, jerking Susan awake to attend to whatever task was required. This teenage girl had no privacy, no rest that belonged to her alone, no moment when she was not at the beck and call of the woman who claimed to own her labor, her time, and her very body. In 1843, Thomas Clemson purchased his own plantation called Canebrake in the Edgefield district of South Carolina, about 1,000 acres. He bought it from Arthur Simpkins, and to staff it, he purchased 37 enslaved people for $6,000 from Anna's cousin John Ewing Calhoun, Jr., who was drowning in debt and feared his enslaved workers would be seized and sold at public auction. Among those 37 human beings was a man named William, a skilled carpenter whom Clemson specifically requested to oversee construction of the family's new home. Anna wrote to family members about the hardships of plantation life, complaining on February 11, 1844, that she had done more hard and dirty work than in all the rest of her life put together. She was now a plantation mistress, responsible for the welfare of the people her husband claimed to own, though her idea of welfare was filtered through the lens of someone who saw enslaved people as perpetual children requiring guidance rather than as adults denied their fundamental human rights. The household at Canebrake included Susan and her family. Susan's father was Bill Lawrence, one of the few enslaved men at Canebrake whom Thomas Clemson referred to with a surname, suggesting some small measure of respect that nonetheless did nothing to change his status as property. Susan's mother Daphne was there too, along with Susan's brother Benjamin. These were the people who made the Clemson household function, who built their home, prepared their food, and cared for their children while their own family bonds existed at the pleasure and profit of their enslavers. 1844. John C. Calhoun became Secretary of State under President John Tyler, and he used his position to secure a diplomatic appointment for his son-in-law. Thomas Clemson became chargé d'affaires to Belgium, the highest-ranking American diplomat to that country. The family prepared to move to Europe, and here the story takes an even more disturbing turn. The Clemsons brought an enslaved man named Basil with them to Belgium. Imagine being enslaved in South Carolina and then being taken across the Atlantic Ocean to a continent where slavery had been abolished, where you could see free black people walking the streets, and yet you remained in bondage because the people who claimed to own you said so. Anna wrote that Basil attracted much attention in Europe because of his skin color, treating him as an exotic curiosity rather than a human being held in chains. The Clemsons left Canebrake under the control of an overseer and an elderly neighbor, trusting white men to manage the enslaved community they had purchased and moved around like chess pieces. Anna quickly became homesick in Belgium. She had never been separated from her father for an extended period, and her letters home reveal her longing to return. But they also reveal something far more disturbing. On January 24, 1846, Anna wrote to her father defending slavery with a passion that matched his own. She wished her mother could have 6 months' trial of what she called the meanness, debased condition, and utter want of truth and honesty among the servants in Europe. She complained that her mother would be sick of white servants for life. Then Anna made an argument that her father had made many times, comparing enslaved people favorably to European wage workers. She wrote that Europeans talked of slavery, but she had never seen in all her life at the South the amount of suffering and misery that one sees in Europe in 1 month. She told anyone who mentioned slavery to make your working classes in Europe as happy as our slaves, and then come back to me, and we will talk about the abolition of slavery. This was not ignorance. This was willful blindness. Anna had education and intelligence. She had traveled and seen other ways of life, and she chose to believe that the people who could be sold away from their families, who could be beaten, who could be worked until their bodies broke, who had no legal rights and no control over their own lives, were somehow better off than free workers who could change jobs, who could own property, who could marry whom they chose, and who could not be bought and sold like livestock. Her father died on March 31st, 1850, while Anna was still in Belgium. She was devastated. She wrote to her brother Patrick that their noble father could never be restored to them, that they would never look upon his like again. She praised him as a man who had never failed in the performance of every duty, conveniently ignoring that his duties, as he saw them, included defending the enslavement of millions. In her grief, Anna elevated her father to an almost saintly status, and with him she elevated his beliefs, including his conviction that slavery was not just acceptable, but morally right. The Clemsons returned to the United States in 1851. They sold cane brake to Alfred Deering for $38,000, which included both the land and the enslaved people who worked it. Thomas Clemson made special provisions in the sale. He requested that if the enslaved people were to be auctioned, they should be sold as families. He made a particular exception for Daphne, specifying that she, her husband Bill Lawrence, and their son Benjamin should be permitted to choose their master. This might seem like a gesture of kindness until you realize that Daphne had asked not to be separated from the other enslaved people at Cane Brake. She was begging to stay with her community, and Clemson was treating that as a favor he was granting, rather than acknowledging the fundamental injustice of selling human beings at all. Among those sold was Susan, who by then had married Billy Richardson, another enslaved man. The Clemsons settled on a modest farm of about 100 acres near Bladensburg, Maryland, which they called the home. This property is particularly interesting because Maryland was a border state where slavery still existed, but was increasingly unstable. The household at the home included no enslaved people, but it did include a young African-American boy named Andy Calhoun. His mother was Nellie, who had been purchased by John and Florid Calhoun in 1848 for $1,000 to work as their cook. A letter from November 12, 1845, written by Florid Calhoun, shows that Nellie was trusted with the keys to the house, having been accustomed to such responsibility all her life. Tragically, in 1856, while living at a house called Macassa in Pendleton, South Carolina, Nellie died in childbirth. After her death, young Andy was relocated to Maryland and placed in Anna's care. Historians note that Andy Calhoun was treated rather special, just as his mother had been. But special treatment within slavery was still slavery. Andy lived in the Clemson household in a border state during the tumultuous years leading up to the Civil War. His exact legal status is unclear, but he was there, a young black boy in a household run by committed defenders of slavery, surrounded by free white people and hired servants, yet separated by the invisible but impenetrable line of race and bondage. On October 3, 1855, Anna gave birth to her fourth child, a daughter they named Cornelia but called Nina. Thomas Clemson especially doted on this child, but she died of scarlet fever in late 1858 at only 3 years old. Anna's grief was profound and eloquent. She cried out, asking where her angel had gone, why she had been taken, lamenting that she would never see her again. A death mask was made of little Nina, and the sculptor Hiram Powers created a marble bust from it that still sits at Fort Hill today, a permanent reminder of loss. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, both Thomas Clemson and their son Calhoun left Maryland to join the Confederate cause. Thomas was 54 years old, and young Calhoun was just 20. They enlisted in the Confederate Army, fighting to preserve a way of life built on enslaved labor. Anna was left to manage the home, crossing hostile lines during the war to visit her mother in South Carolina. She packed up possessions and mailed them to relatives, hoping they would survive the conflict. She moved temporarily to a 5-room place near Baltimore to be safer. In September 1863, young Calhoun was captured in Bolivar, Mississippi. He spent 18 months imprisoned at Johnson Island in Lake Erie, Ohio, a federal prison about 3 miles from present-day Sandusky. Anna's courage and devotion as a mother were tested. She immediately began a tireless campaign for permission to visit her son, and once she achieved it, she embarked alone through enemy territory to see him. In a letter dated April 21, 1864, she described Calhoun as very well despite a sore leg, noting he seemed delighted and astonished by her visit. Before moving back to South Carolina in December 1864, Anna's daughter Florid wrote in her diary that Andy would not be returning with them because he was free with all Maryland Negroes. Maryland had abolished slavery that year, and Andy Calhoun simply disappears from the historical record, one more person whose story was deemed unworthy of preservation. The war ended in 1865, and the Confederacy fell. The people at Fort Hill and plantations across the South were freed, though freedom came with its own challenges and betrayals during Reconstruction. Anna's mother, Florid, died in 1866, and Anna inherited portions of Fort Hill. Her brother, Andrew Pickens Calhoun, had operated the plantation during the war years, and by 1865, the inventory showed 139 enslaved people living there. After emancipation, Thomas Clemson began signing employment contracts in 1868 with formerly enslaved people from Fort Hill and neighboring plantations, paying them wages for labor that had been stolen for generations. Tragedy continued to stalk the Clemson family. In July 1871, Anna's daughter Florid, who had married Gideon Lee Jr., died after a long illness. 17 days later, on August 10, 1871, their son Calhoun died from injuries suffered in a train wreck in Oconee County, South Carolina. He was 29 years old, both surviving children, gone within 17 days of each other. Anna and Thomas retired to Fort Hill in 1872, moving into the house that held so many memories, both bitter and sweet. In the years that remained to her, Anna and Thomas discussed starting an agricultural college in upstate South Carolina. They decided it would be situated at Fort Hill, and that John C. Calhoun's house would remain on the land as a monument to his legacy. On August 9, 1874, Anna selected a committee to issue a circular calling for statewide support for the plan to build a scientific agricultural college on Fort Hill's land. One of the main points was to spread the word that the college would be built in the legacy of her father, John C. Calhoun, who had done so much for the state of South Carolina. The irony was apparently lost on Anna that much of what her father had done for South Carolina involved defending and expanding slavery, and that the land they wanted to use for education had been worked by people denied any education at all. Anna complained little about her health problems, but she was significantly overweight and suffered from a genetic heart condition that had killed her brother Andrew suddenly in 1865. On September 22, 1875, at 58 years old, Anna Maria Calhoun Clemson died of a sudden heart attack at Fort Hill. She was buried in St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery in Pendleton, South Carolina, near other family members. Her will did not specifically mention creating a college, but previous communications between her and Thomas made clear their shared vision. Thomas Green Clemson lived another 13 years, and in those years he worked with attorneys to craft a bequest that would establish the college they had envisioned. When he died on April 6, 1888, his will left 3/4 of the Fort Hill plantation and $80,000 to the state of South Carolina for the establishment of a scientific and agricultural college. In honor of his wife and using her land, he created what would become Clemson Agricultural College, which opened in July 1893 with a student body of 446 male cadets. Today, it stands as Clemson University, a major research institution with tens of thousands of students. The motto of the Clemson University Women's Alumni Council became, "Her Land, His Plan," acknowledging Anna's role as co-founder of the institution. But whose land was it really? The ground beneath Fort Hill had belonged to the Cherokee people before colonists burned their town of Seneca to the ground and killed most of its inhabitants in 1776. The land was then worked by enslaved African Americans who built the buildings, grew the crops, and maintained the property for decades. The labor of their hands created the wealth that made the plantation valuable. Their stolen work made possible the bequest that created the university. Researchers at Clemson have worked for years to document the names and stories of the people enslaved at Fort Hill. The 1854 deed, when Andrew Pickens Calhoun purchased the plantation from his mother, listed 50 enslaved people in family groups. Old Sawney, aged 59, and his wife Tilla, aged 50, headed the list, followed by Ned, Nicholas, Jonas, Jim, Matilda, and Chapman. The 1865 appraisal after Andrew's death listed 139 enslaved people. Recent research using a ground-penetrating radar has identified more than 600 previously unmarked graves in Woodland Cemetery at Clemson, the final resting places of enslaved people and later of convicted laborers, many of them children, who were forced to work building the university. Among those documented names are people whose stories intersect with Anna's directly. Susan Clemson Richardson, the girl who slept with a string around her wrist, survived to see freedom. She married and had 6 children. There is a photograph of her from around 1880, decades after slavery ended, holding a white child named Byron Herlong. She lived to be 82, dying in 1910 in Aiken, South Carolina, while living with one of her sons. Her mother Daphne, who had nursed Anna's children while enslaved at Fort Hill and Cane Brake, was sold along with her family when the Clemsons left South Carolina for Europe. Their fates after that sale are harder to trace. There are stories of resistance, too. A man named Sawney Jr., son of Old Sawney, set fire to a white overseer's tent, apparently trying to kill him. He was sent to Alabama as punishment. His sister Icy tried to burn down Fort Hill itself by placing hot coals under a pillow in one of the bedrooms. Fortunately for the Calhoun family, the smell of burning feathers alerted them, and they extinguished the fire. Issei, too, was sent to Alabama, though she eventually returned. These were not happy servants. These were people desperate enough to risk terrible punishment, even death, for a chance at freedom or revenge. A man named Alec ran away in 1831 after Florida Calhoun threatened to whip him. An elderly woman known as Menemen, who may have been born in Africa, was said in an 1849 newspaper article to be 112 years old with 63 living descendants on the plantation. Her partner was Polydor, and together they had at least 10 children. Enslaved people at Fort Hill were allowed to grow small patches of cotton for themselves, and a reporter noted they were as shrewd in getting the highest price for it as white planters, as perfectly conversant about fluctuations in the markets in Liverpool and New York as a cotton broker. Intelligence and business acumen wasted in bondage. Going back further, in 1798, 5 people enslaved by John Ewing Calhoun, Anna's maternal grandfather, plotted to poison their enslavers and flee. Hazard, Suki, Sue, Jack, and Will did poison the Calhoun family, though no one died. Will was hanged for his role in obtaining the poison. The other 4 were whipped, branded on the forehead, and had their ears cropped as punishment. This was the legacy Anna inherited, a legacy written in scars and blood and stolen lives. Anna Maria Calhoun Clemson was not unique in her beliefs. She was a product of her time and place, raised in a society that told her from birth that slavery was natural, necessary, and even beneficial. Many white women of her class and region shared her views. But being common does not make beliefs right, and being a product of one's time does not excuse moral blindness, especially when there were people in that same time who saw slavery for what it was and fought against it. The abolition movement existed during Anna's lifetime. People were writing, speaking, and dying to end slavery. The Underground Railroad was spiriting people to freedom. Some white Southerners, though admittedly few, opposed slavery. Anna had access to these alternative perspectives, yet she chose to embrace the system that enriched her family. What makes Anna's story particularly significant is the way her personal life and legacy intersect with American education. Clemson University stands today as a testament to her vision and her land, but also as a reminder of how institutions we value can be built on foundations of injustice. The university has grappled with this history in recent years, particularly in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2020, the university renamed Calhoun Honors College to simply Clemson University Honors College. The statue of John C. Calhoun that once towered over Marion Square in Charleston was removed. Debates continue about whether to rename Tillman Hall, named for Ben Tillman, an avowed white supremacist and former South Carolina governor. Professor Rhonda Thomas has led efforts through a project called Call My Name to document the contributions of 6 generations of free and enslaved people of African descent in Clemson University's history. The project includes not just those enslaved before the Civil War, but also sharecroppers who worked the land afterward, and convicted laborers who were forced to build the university's early structures. Between 1890 and 1915, Clemson College trustees successfully petitioned the South Carolina State Assembly at least 3 times for permission to lease incarcerated boys and men from the state penitentiary to help build the campus. The men and boys assigned to this detail came from nearly every county in South Carolina and ranged in age from 12 to 67. The majority were under 25. They cleared land, made bricks, erected buildings, farmed crops, all while imprisoned, many on petty charges designed to recreate slavery through the legal system. The Call My Name project includes descendants of the enslaved who have come forward with family stories, photographs, and documents. Eva Hester Martin and her daughter Valerie Martin Lee are descendants of Sharper and Caroline and their daughter Matilda, who were enslaved on Fort Hill Plantation. Eric Young, who graduated from Clemson in 1995, is a descendant of the Fruster family, whose ancestors are pictured in front of Fort Hill in an 1883 photograph. For these families, the history is not abstract. It lives in their DNA, in the stories passed down, in the gaps where information should be but has been erased. The university has suggested that reparations could come in the form of tuition scholarships for descendants of people buried in Woodland Cemetery, similar to a program Georgetown University launched in 2019. Professors now incorporate the cemetery's uncomfortable history into classes. Admissions office guides include it in campus tours. But these gestures, while meaningful, cannot undo centuries of theft and brutality. They cannot give back the lives that were stolen, the families that were torn apart, the children who grew up knowing they could be sold at any moment. Anna Maria Calhoun Clemson died believing she had lived a righteous life. She died believing her father had been a great man whose legacy deserved to be celebrated. She died believing that the agricultural college they were founding would honor that legacy and serve the people of South Carolina. In some ways, she was right. Clemson University has educated hundreds of thousands of students and contributed to agricultural science and technology. But the legacy is complicated in ways Anna could not or would not see. The land she inherited was stolen twice over, first from indigenous people and then enriched by enslaved labor. The wealth that made the university possible came from the work of people who were denied education themselves, who could be beaten for learning to read, who had no legal right to the fruits of their labor. Anna defended this system not out of ignorance, but out of investment. She benefited from slavery her entire life, and she could not imagine a world without it, so she convinced herself it was good. In letters and in life, Anna presented herself as a woman of refinement and education, devoted to family and to her father's principles. She traveled to Europe, spoke multiple languages, and moved in the highest circles of society. She suffered personal tragedies that would break anyone, losing 4 of her children and watching her son imprisoned during war. She felt real emotions, real grief, real love. But her empathy had boundaries drawn by race and status. The grief of enslaved mothers whose children were sold away did not move her to question the system. The suffering of people who worked from sunrise to sunset with no hope of freedom did not shake her faith in slavery's righteousness. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Anna's story. She was not a monster. She was not unusually cruel by the standards of her time and place. She would have been considered by her contemporaries to be a good person, a devoted daughter and wife, an educated and accomplished woman. And therein lies the lesson. Systems of oppression do not require monsters to operate. They require ordinary people who benefit from injustice to look away, to rationalize, to compare themselves favorably to someone else, rather than confronting the fundamental immorality of the system itself. Anna compared enslaved people to European wage workers and declared the enslaved better off, but she never asked them if they agreed. She never wondered if they might prefer poverty with freedom to comfort in chains. She never questioned whether she had the right to own another human being in the first place. She accepted the world as she found it because that world treated her well, and she lacked either the moral courage or the imagination to envision something different. The university that bears her husband's name and sits on her land now wrestles with this history. Students walk past Fort Hill, past markers explaining that enslaved people built and maintained the house, past the cemetery where hundreds of black bodies rest in graves that were forgotten or deliberately paved over. The tension between educational opportunity and the reality of how that opportunity was funded cannot be resolved easily. You cannot undo the past. You cannot bring back the dead. You cannot unsteal the labor that created the wealth that endowed the university. What you can do is remember. You can speak the names of people like Susan and Daphne and Sonny and Icy and Alec. You can tell the truth about people like Maria Calhoun Clemson, acknowledging both her role in founding an educational institution and her complicity in human bondage. You can resist the temptation to sanitize history or to excuse the inexcusable by pointing to the customs of the time. You can recognize that the choices people make within unjust systems matter, even when those systems constrain those choices. Maria Calhoun Clemson died in 1895, 10 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. She lived just long enough to see the world she had defended and justified crumble around her. She never acknowledged that she had been wrong. She never apologized to the people her family had enslaved. She never questioned whether the legacy she wanted to honor, her father's legacy, was worth honoring at all. She simply held on to her beliefs until the end, and then she was gone. But the consequences of her beliefs and her choices did not die with her. They live on in the debates about Confederate monuments and honors colleges named after slavery's defenders. They live on in the economic and educational disparities that trace their roots directly to slavery and its aftermath. They live on in the unmarked graves beneath Clemson's campus, in the families still searching for ancestors whose names appear on inventories as property, rather than in family Bibles as beloved relatives. Her land, his plan. That was the motto celebrating Anna's contribution to Clemson University. But it was never really her land. It was land worked by people who had no choice, who received no share of the wealth they created, who built the very foundations of the institution that now educates students in their names. It was land that has a longer, deeper, more painful history than any single family's claim to ownership. Maria Calhoun Clemson's story is not one of simple villains and heroes. It is a story of how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil by accepting the world as it is rather than imagining what it could be. It is a story of how wealth and opportunity built on injustice cast long shadows across generations. It is a story of how education and oppression can be intertwined in ways that make us uncomfortable, but that we must confront if we hope to build a more just future. The string that tied Susan's wrist to Anna's bedside was cut long ago. Susan lived to see freedom, to marry, to raise children, to grow old. But the metaphorical strings that connect us to this history, that bind us to reckon with how the institutions we value came to be, those strings remain. We can choose to pull on them, to wake ourselves from comfortable narratives, to face the complicated truth. Or we can choose to ignore them and pretend the past has nothing to do with the present. Anna made her choice. She chose to defend slavery even when confronted with alternatives. She chose to benefit from a system of human ownership and to pass that benefit on to future generations through the university she helped establish. We cannot change her choices, but we can choose how we remember her, how we tell her story, and what lessons we draw from a life lived in service to beliefs that history has judged harshly and rightly so. The land remembers, even when we would prefer to forget. The graves remember. The descendants remember. And now, perhaps, we will remember too.